What's up? It's episode 3 of this whole Egypt's entire history series, and we just covered ancient times and prehistoric times. But today we're going to be covering how the current Egyptian identity has evolved to what it is today. And I think we're in the... This is when the ancient Egyptian religion that was ruling for all thousands of years becomes Christianity. It changes over. For those of you who don't know, my family is Coptic, and Coptic linguistically actually comes from the word Egypt, but Coptic is now said as just, we're like the Egyptian Christians who date back to this time. It really doesn't take that long for Christianity in Egypt to really spread, and where the ancient Egyptian religion dies very, very fastly. I believe from the introduction to Christianity all the way to 535 AD is when you see the last ancient Egyptian temple religion closed officially. So as many Christians know, the Roman Empire was very, very tough on Christians early on. For example, we have Diocletian, who persecuted the living shite out of Christians. Not only in Egypt, by the way, in the entire Roman Empire. But then, in a weird turn of events, Constantine decides that he loves Jesus. Sick. A historical full 180. So we're cool. It's like 600 AD. Most of the Egyptians are Christian. There's a lot of Jewish people there too. But as you know, Egyptians are not Christian today. They're mostly Muslim. So how does that happen? Islam was first introduced in Egypt around 641 AD, and the first Muslims to come were very tolerant of everyone's religion. Hey, very is a strong word. Wasn't free cupcakes every day, but compared to the successors, and you will see, they were much more tolerant. Also, I'm not an expert. Please, everything with a grain of salt. I could be completely wrong. Don't quote me, please. Please. For example, if you were Christian, you paid a designated tax, and as long as you paid that tax and did your civic duty, you weren't mandated to go to war, and tolerance was so high that conversion was very low. Meaning most Christians didn't convert to Islam during this period. There was some conversion to Islam, but generally speaking, people stayed in their religious sects. But during the Umayyad Caliphate, which I'm going to mispronounce every single one of these, so do not come for me. There was an increased pressure of Christians of Egypt to convert to Islam. Taxes for non-Muslims started to become a bit unreasonable. There is said to be a lot of civil unrest, a lot of extortion, a lot of bad things happening to a lot of non-Muslim Christians during this time. And it wasn't necessarily just the religion, but it was also Egyptian culture. For example, the language of Egypt transitions from Coptic or Egyptian to, I think in 706 AD, Arabic officially. But for my Arabic speakers, you'll notice that Egyptian Arabic is very unique. It's called Masri, right? Egyptian Arabic is actually linguistically Arabic with a lot of Coptic or ancient Egyptian words thrown in there and mixed up. But after a few caliphates, a very weird thing happens where a slave population becomes the ruler of Egypt. The slave population are called the Mamluks. The Mamluks were these slaves from Europe that were used as military slaves. They were trained as children to become like badass killers, apparently. Basically, this demographic started to gain power until eventually they become the rulers of Egypt themselves. Now, from my understanding, the Mamluks, though at one point great fighters, were very, very bad rulers. They ended up taxing the Egyptian people so badly for their land and their crops that it ended up causing great famine and just a complete deterioration of the Egyptian economy. And in combination with their mismanagement, when the Black Plague came, it completely decimated the population of Alexandria, and it just kind of all fell apart. This would leave way for the next rulers of Egypt, the Ottomans, to take over for the next, what is it, like 400 years? 1500, 1600, 1700, 1800, 1900, 400 years. Yeah, 400 years. Why did I have to count that? Jesus. Ottomans, unlike a lot of rulers, did not rule in Egypt necessarily, but they ended up remotely ruling Egypt through the Mamluks. So they allowed the Mamluks to rule Egypt, but they were really the big decision makers. Now, full confession, the whole Ottoman rule situation of Egypt is really confusing, and honestly, the history kind of confuses me as well. So a lot of rulers are going to come in and out of Egypt, but the Ottomans, I think, technically are still the rulers. It's really confusing, so stay with me. So under Ottoman rule, during 1798, the famously short but not actually short ruler Napoleon from France comes to take over Egypt. But it doesn't take very long for the French to eventually be kicked out by the British, Mamluk, and Ottomans. But an important side note about Napoleon is that he was a great appreciator of culture. Great appreciator of culture is a strong statement. He was like a
like an ancient culture vulture, you know? He was kind of a dick still.
And during this time, he brought a lot of people to study Egyptian culture, Egyptian history, Egyptian plants and animals, and the formation of Egyptology really gets its roots during this period. For example, the Rosetta Stone pretty soon after gets deciphered so we can read ancient Egyptian. The Rosetta Stone was a very important find in the journey of Egyptology and the understanding of what we know of Egypt today. Mind you, the Egyptian language was not spoken by Egyptians anymore. The Egyptian population now spoke Arabic like it does today, and the only remnants of ancient Egyptian language existed in the Coptic churches, where, by the way, is still spoken today, but the understanding of hieroglyphs and other scripts of the ancient times like Demotic, Hieratic, was lost. The hieroglyphs at this point were not understood by anyone, including native Egyptians. The hieroglyphs were seen as this mystery, and really ancient Egyptian culture was somewhat of a mystery. How these temples got here, what they lived like, how was culture like, was really misunderstood by everyone. But when the Rosetta Stone was deciphered, all of that got unlocked. The mysteries of what the hieroglyphs said, which people would make these crazy stories up about how, oh, it's just a list of how many bales of wheat someone got paid, or just random stuff. All of that started to make sense. I'm rambling. Anyways, it's time to move on. I promise you, Egyptian history of today is just around the corner. In 1805, a very integral ruler to Egyptian civilization today comes on the scene called Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali was not Egyptian, he was Albanian. But when him and his people come on the scene, they massacre the Mamluks that were previously ruling because everyone generally hated the Mamluks. And under Muhammad Ali's rule, Egypt is modernized to catch up with the rest of the world very quickly. Ali starts manufacturing firearms. Modern ships are built. Education is increased. Also, I believe this is when cotton or Egyptian cotton starts to become a very popular crop for Egyptians to grow. By the way, slavery, super a thing right now.
An interesting thing about slavery during this period, and earlier as well, is that it wasn't just other Africans like Sudanese getting enslaved, but it was also some white people were getting enslaved, and I believe in other parts of the Arabian world, other people were getting enslaved as well.
But many people are going to be angry about me saying this, but slavery was still very much a racial thing. A lot of Egyptians and a lot of people in the Arab world will tell you, no, we enslaved everyone. No, it was definitely different races got treated differently and had different jobs. So make no confusion, it was very much racial. But after Ali, we have, I believe it's pronounced Ismail Pasha, which creates the Suez Canal. Also, there's this Egyptian-Ethiopian war that goes really, really bad for Egypt because, generally speaking in history, don't mess with Ethiopia. They're a tough bunch. But the Egyptian-Ethiopian war goes so badly for Pasha that he ends up having to give his rights of the Suez Canal to Britain. They were already on the scene, but after this point, the Brits start to get real powerful in Egypt. So as a lot of you already know, British colonial rule, generally speaking around the world, not fun for anyone who gets colonized by them. They stole a lot of stuff, they mistreated the natives of Egypt quite badly. But in the early 1900s, a very interesting thing happens to Egyptian people's identity or how they see themselves. A thing called the Egyptian labor corps start to become a thing. And it was the system where the Brits would quite literally enslave native Egyptians from Said or Fayoum, so like poor village guys, and make them serve in war. As I just explained, Egyptians during this time were no strangers to slavery. They'd seen other Africans be enslaved or other people be enslaved in Egypt left and right. In fact, they were doing the enslaving often, so they knew what it looked like. But when the British started to do it to the Egyptian people, they had to decide, okay, how do we pivot to keep ourselves from getting enslaved?
Quick caveat, I made it sound like Egyptian labor corps were like the foundation to all this revolution. To clarify, this was just Egypt was getting colonized. Much of the people around, all the countries around us, were also going through this transformative era. So the politics of this time are super complex, and I'm oversimplifying it almost to a disrespectful amount. Like, there's so many moving parts that I just don't even know, so.
To cope with this, a lot of different ideas start to jump around in Egyptian people's heads. Pan-Arabism, Pan-Islamism, the Communist Party. There's even this movement called the Pharaohist movement, and it was the idea that Egyptians were one of the greatest Mediterranean, specifically Mediterranean, civilizations of human history. Pharaonism spoke to Egyptian people's pride, saying that Egyptians or Egypt was one of the great human civilizations of all human history. You can't treat us like other colored folk, like how they were treating Sudanese people or Indian people, because we're different. We're one of the greatest civilizations ever. You can't treat us like this. In 1919, there's the Great Egyptian Revolution. And after a few years, you get a ruler that's name is not only known just in Egypt, but all throughout the Arab world. Nasser. Nasser? Nasser? Oh, I'm gonna get roasted so bad. And you know about all those ideas I was just telling you about, pan-Arabism, pan-Islamism, communism, how they all started to come in, there's these debates? Pan-Arabism with Nasser starts to become the thing. To help you understand who Nasser is to Egyptians and the rest of Arabic-speaking world, he is loved by Arabs. He spoke to a lot of Arab people during this time because he fought for anti-colonialist rule. He fought for Arabs being Arabs. We are one group. We all need to unite and be powerful together. We can debate how great of a ruler he was to this demographic or that demographic, but he wasn't perfect, and I think most people can acknowledge that. For example, this is when the dam in Aswan was built. Why that's important is because a lot of Nubian people were displaced and moved away from their ancestral home during that time.
And it wasn't just Nubians that got kicked out. During 1956, 1957, there was this huge expulsion of pretty much everyone who wasn't Egyptian. Armenians, Jewish people, British, French, I mean, everyone got kicked out. Their things got confiscated. It was a huge event.
When he dies, it is a tragedy to everyone in the region. People cry in the streets, it's mayhem. But after him, we have Anwar Sadat. Sadat's rule in Egypt was very confusing for a number of reasons, but a big thing that changes in Egypt is that conservatism with Islam becomes very strict. Before Sadat, Islam was still very important to the Egyptian people, but during Sadat, the integration of the Quran and the rules of it and the Egyptian government starts to fuse even stronger a bond. And this high religiosity, or more specifically conservatism, is still seen today in Egypt. But like I said, Sadat's rule was very confusing for a number of reasons, and he ends up getting assassinated. Then we have Mubarak, who rules for a very long time, during certain periods is liked by some and hated by others, and it evolves and changes in a lot of different ways. It's really confusing. But the Arab Spring happens, he's sentenced to prison, and then it's overturned, and then Morsi comes, that doesn't last very long, and then we have Sisi. Bam! Oh my God, that was really hard. That was so much research. That was so much research. Venmo me or Cash App me $1 if you liked this, because I literally haven't worked in days because I've been researching. Oh my God, please. During this whole trip, I think an interesting thing to point out is that everyone always talks about Egypt in two ways. Oh, there's ancient Egypt and current Egypt. But I think what this whole story shows is that it was never really two separate things, but it was this gradual evolution and change of the Egyptian people's identity, religion, languages. But the ancient Egyptians are still here today. For example, molokhia. It's a dish served so common in all Egyptian households in Egypt, and it was eaten by the ancient Egyptians. The ancient Egyptian people were never erased. We just changed, and we're here today. And I, like many of you, are very